One of the worst wartime experiences was the concentration camps. These horrible Nazi death camps killed huge numbers of people. Many were left crippled for life, and for the rest of their lives, they remembered their time in a concentration camp with horror. The Ravensbrück camp was created especially for women, but they were subjected to physical and psychological torture, just like the men in other concentration camps. There is not much information about this camp, because the Germans, when the Soviets took it over, tried to destroy as many documents as possible that testified to their horrible criminal activities. The horrors at Ravensbrück were learnt about from the prisoners who were held there. The camp was built in the late 1930s. At first, only Germans who led an antisocial way of life were kept there. But then gypsies were brought there, and then women of other nationalities who were captured during the Second World War. Living conditions in the concentration camp were very difficult. In summer, women were raised at 4 a.m., in winter a little later. Almost all the women worked. Some were engaged in sewing uniforms for German soldiers, and some did difficult physical work. The working day lasted 12 to 14 hours. There was only one break, and it lasted 30 minutes. The food was very poor. Only water and bread were given for breakfast. Dinner was the same, and only during the lunch break was a meager meal given. Checks were carried out twice a day, but the women tried not to complain about their well-being. They also tried not to get sick, because anyone who could not work was sent to the crematorium ovens. In addition, various experiments were carried out in Ravensbrück. One of the most famous experiments was a study of the effects of sulfonamide. This drug was used to treat gunshot wounds, and to understand how it affects the body and how to improve it, experiments were conducted on female subjects. Those who were selected for the research were called guinea pigs. A total of 74 people were selected. Most of the selected women were of Polish nationality. Perfectly healthy women were deliberately mutilated. For example, their legs were deliberately broken and fragments of muscle or bone were taken. Then they watched how the torn muscle tissue and dead nerve endings healed. Sometimes they tried to transplant the removed body parts into other test subjects. The most significant cycle of experiments was to test the effectiveness of the anti-infective drug sulfonamide. To make the experiment really effective, it was necessary that the test subjects had wounds that resembled battle wounds. Naturally, the women did not have such wounds, and they created them artificially. The leg was cut, usually near the thigh, and they'd put live bacteria into the wound to cause infection. And then the wound would be stitched up. The bacterial infections used were strep, tetanus, gas gangrene. Also, small chips, sawdust, glass chips. Glass was placed in the wound to make it more realistic. That is, all those elements that could get into the wound of a wounded soldier. And also specially stopped the blood flow by tying the vessels in the upper and lower parts of the wound. And then they observed those who were deliberately infected. Of the 74 participants in the experiment, 5 died immediately after the operation. 6 women were sentenced to execution because they could no longer do any work after the wounds were inflicted. All the others survived, but most of the survivors remained crippled for life. After the horrible experiment, many people limped or could not walk at all. The wounds healed or began to bleed again. Some people's legs swelled up and turned blue. Pus appeared inside, which eventually came out on its own. Naturally, no medical help was given to such subjects. They were administered only the drug, which was ineffective. Accordingly, the rabbits were left to their fate. All the victims of these experiments showed incredible willpower and endurance. They became a team and supported each other. Gradually, they were helped by other prisoners, usually from among the Polish underground. Each of the subjects had a partner who protected and cared for her. The experiments were extremely resented by the prisoners. Despite the horrible conditions of detention, they did not lose their fortitude and were ready to resist. The camp authorities announced to them that the experiments would be stopped. However, in March 1943, the 5 prisoners were called back to the operation. The next day, several of the guinea pigs went to negotiate with the senior warden. They even made a written protest to the camp director. But a couple of days later, a new batch of prisoners were called in for experiments. Of the 5 people invited, 2 protested. One simply refused to go, and the other escaped through a window. Such protest had an effect. At the end of April, it was decided that only people with mental illnesses would be used as guinea pigs. When it became clear in early 1945 that Germany was losing the Second World War, the Ravensbrück authorities decided to execute the prisoners. First of all, those who participated in the experiments. All the women held in the camp were led out onto the parade ground. Then French and Russian women were put separately. The Polish women were separated in this way, but those who were not to be shot rushed into their crowd, and there was a clash, in which the guards were also involved. As a result, the rabbits managed to escape. Many of them hid. One of the prisoners recalled that 4 people were constantly in the linen room at night, hiding behind stacks of linen. They were very cold because it was winter, and the linen rooms did not have the necessary heating. Others took blankets, shovels, food, and buried themselves under the barracks. It was very cold there, and there was nothing to breathe. There were also huge rats running around all the time. The barrack inmates lived in such a shelter for 7 days. It was not possible to carry out a mass execution. The guinea pigs were 2 women who interacted with the camp authorities. They tried to persuade them to surrender and sign a statement that their scars had been caused by an industrial accident. Threats were also used, but the prisoners did not agree. Many of them remained in hiding until the Red Army liberated Ravensbrück. This happened on 30th April 1945. While still in the camp, the prisoners decided to tell at all costs about the horrible experiments that had been carried out on them in Ravensbrück. 2 Polish prisoners wrote letters with urine between the lines. The first letters of the lines of the letter contained the phrase urine letter. The censors who checked the letters did not notice anything, and the letters reached the relatives of one of the prisoners. The prisoner's uncle sent the letters to London, Geneva, and the International Red Cross. The prisoners realized that their mutilated legs were the main evidence of the horrible crimes committed in Ravensbrück. So, they hid the camera and photographed their wounds, and they kept the film under the floorboards in the barracks. In April 1945, an agreement was made between Heinrich Gimmer and the head of the Swedish Red Cross, according to which 7,500 prisoners of the camp were sent to Sweden for treatment, except that the guinea pigs were not included in that number, because they became clear evidence of Nazi experiments. The film with photographs of their mutilated limbs was then given to a French woman named Germaine Tillon. She developed it in Paris. 4 prisoners from among the guinea pigs then appeared at the Nuremberg trials. As a result, 3 of the concentration camp doctors were convicted. After the war, the women who survived the experiments returned to Poland. At that time, Ravensbrück was located on the territory of the GDR. Therefore, it was the communist resistance to the Nazis that was mostly glorified, and the resistance of other nations was not given such great importance, and the courageous resistance of the rabbits was gradually forgotten. In addition, the victims of Ravensbrück could not expect compensation from the FRG, because the camp itself was now located in another territory. It was not until the 1950s that the communist government of Poland sent 35 prisoners involved in the Ravensbrück experiments to the United States for treatment. But the ultimate resistance of the courageous women was not forgotten. Their story is still a testament to the brutality of Nazism today, and a reminder of the need to preserve humanity and peaceful coexistence.